In this short video, I want to introduce one of the many writers of the early to mid-20th century who was popular in his day but is now largely forgotten, in this case Chiang Yee, or the Silent Traveller. I came across Chiang by accident whilst browsing in an antique shop on a holiday, where I found this copy of The Silent Traveller in London. Flicking through it, the illustrations intrigued me, so I bought it, and I'm very glad that I did. It turned out to be delightful, a gentle, wry, insightful look at the life of London in the 1930s from the viewpoint of a foreigner. It includes descriptions of the tourist sites, but also comment on everyday life and observation of people and places, often in comparison with similar places or occurrences in contemporary China. The writing style is engaging and restful, and the whole book is punctuated with the author's poems, drawings and paintings. Definitely a good junk shop find. Researching the author later, I discovered a fascinating character. Chiang Yee was born in 1903 in Zhujiang in the Jiangxi province of eastern China. He was a younger son of a wealthy landowning family, and his traditional education helped him to become a talented artist and poet. His public life included a stint in the army and then as a teacher, before he entered local politics, serving as magistrate in 3 different counties. However, disagreement with the developing political situation in the country caused him to travel to England in 1933. He initially intended to stay in England for just a few years, studying at the London School of Economics before returning, and as such his wife Zheng Yun and their 4 children remained in China. However, the outbreak of war with Japan in 1937 made travel back to China impossible, and the subsequent political situation in his homeland meant that Chiang was unable to return until 1975, after an absence of over 40 years. Chiang Yee stayed in England until 1955. During the 1930s, he taught at the University of London and worked at the Wellcome Collection, but he also began to publish books. His first was an art book entitled The Chinese Eye, an interpretation of Chinese painting, published in 1935. And he later wrote 2 books on Chinese calligraphy. His most popular works, however, were the Silent Traveller series of books, the first of which, subtitled A Chinese Artist in Lakeland, was published in 1937. This was followed in 1938 by The Silent Traveller in London, which has recently been reprinted as part of a series of lost and found classic works of travel writing. In 1939, just after the outbreak of war in Europe, Chiang wrote The Silent Traveller in Wartime. This gave his impressions of London in the early days of the war, but also allowed him to reflect on the effect of the global conflict on his own life, and particularly on the circumstance of being forcibly separated from his family and having to watch helplessly as his homeland was subject to the ravages of war. He was especially affected by the news of the death of his older brother in April 1938. The Silent Traveller in Wartime is dedicated to his memory. Despite this, the book is still warm, interesting, funny and ultimately hopeful. Following the destruction of his London lodgings by enemy bombing in 1940, Chiang moved to Oxford. A wartime holiday led to the writing of The Silent Traveller in the Yorkshire Dales in 1941, and The Silent Traveller in Oxford was published in 1944. Of all the Chiang Yee books I've read, I think this is my favourite. It has the same witty and observant style as all the other Silent Traveller books, and offers fascinating insights into the lifestyle and people of the times, with some especially funny sections on the life of the university. But this one seems to dwell even more expressively than usual on the solace and joy Chiang takes from the beauty of nature, and on the similarities he sees between people in China and in England, and the optimism it gives him for the future. With the end of the war, the Silent Traveller started moving further abroad, with The Silent Traveller in Edinburgh appearing in 1948, New York in 1950 and Dublin in 1953. In this post-war period too, the author's eldest son, Chiang Chien-kuo, emigrated from China to join his father in England. In 1955, Chiang Yee left England and moved to the United States, where he became a lecturer at Columbia University. His younger son, Chiang Chien-fei, moved to the US in the 1960s. Chiang Yee continued to write his travel books and published The Silent Traveller in Paris in 1956, Boston in 1959 and San Francisco in 1963. The final book in the series is, possibly rather surprisingly given his history, The Silent Traveller in Japan, which was published in 1972. I haven't as yet read any of these later books. In addition to the silent traveller books and his works on Chinese art and calligraphy, Chiang Yee produced 2 autobiographical books about his homeland. The first was 1940's A Chinese Childhood, in which he describes the traditions and lifestyle of his family home in his earliest years. This was before the 1911 revolution, which greatly changed the traditional life of rural China, so this book was partly a memorial to a vanishing culture, as well as an introduction for European audiences to a lifestyle about which most would have known very little. At the very end of his life, he wrote China Revisited after 42 years, which was published in 1977. In the late 1930s and the 1940s, Chiang Yee also wrote a number of children's books, beginning with Chin Pao and the Giant Pandas in 1939. In 1975, Chiang Yee finally returned to China and lived there for 2 years until his death at the age of 74. Although largely overlooked for some time, the importance and influence of Chiang Yee's work in bringing Chinese culture to the attention of the West has recently been the subject of increasing interest. His writing is enjoyable, engaging and accessible, and throughout his career he tried to emphasise the similarities between peoples from different parts of the world. He remains optimistic and curious throughout his books and uses funny, wry observation to gently point out some of the silliness of life as well as its joys. In 2019, a blue plaque was mounted on the house where he stayed in Oxford. In the Bromley House collection we have 8 of his books, including 7 of the silent traveller works and A Chinese Childhood. I would heartily recommend them to anyone.